Hello and welcome back to the Faith and Culture Show. I'm Catherine Camp, your hostess for the show. This is where we dig in deeply in order to educate ourselves about the world around us. And we do this because we want to begin to engage our culture with conversations that count, conversations with an eternal perspective. And one of the perspectives that we want to really brush up on and understand is science and faith. Do they go together? I say yes. Well, today I have someone that I have really looked up to for many years. I know that Dr. Rana does not remember this at all, but I actually heard him speak for the first time in 2013 at a summer seminar. And I'm so thrilled to be able to have him on the show and introduce him to you all. He is a biochemist. His name is Fazale Rana, as some people know him as Fuzz. He's the president, CEO, and senior scholar at Reasons to Believe. He holds a PhD in chemistry with an emphasis in biochemistry from Ohio University. He is the author of several groundbreaking books, including Fit for a Purpose, Thinking About Evolution, and Humans 2.0. He has spoken at hundreds of universities, churches, and conferences worldwide. So welcome, Dr. Rana. Thank you, like I said before, really for being here. It means a lot to me. Science is, I always tell people I'm a shade tree scientist. It's something I've been interested in all my life. I'm surprised I didn't get into science as a total profession, but that's okay. God had other plans.
Yeah, well, Catherine, it's great to be on your show. And, when we chatted last fall at the Steadfast conference, you looked so familiar to me. And in the introduction, now I know where I met you prior to that conversation, which was at a summer school. So it's great to see you again.
Yes. I have met you. We have spoken several times in between. It hasn't just been since 2013. But it's been at different conferences. I was much more active speaking before 2020. And then I started teaching in 2016. So I wasn't as active going around being an itinerant speaker, which is so much fun. I do enjoy it, but that's okay. I go wherever God opens doors, that's where I go. Yeah. So yes, sir. I really love your work. And I think it's important in our day and age, because we live in such a humanist society that it's very secular. People feel like, well, if you're a Christian, and people tell me, oh, well, you're really religious, so I don't expect you to understand this. And I'm always thinking, well, I have faith in God. I don't really see myself as religious. I'm a Christian, and God created science. He made it so that we could understand the world around us. So I want you to just tell us a little bit about your walk and how you I guess went from probably, were you an atheist at one time?
Yeah, for all intents and purposes, I would say that's true.
Okay, because I do know it's true about a lot of scientists. And once they really start looking at things differently, something happens.
Yeah. Well, I actually grew up in somewhat of an unusual home. My father was a Muslim. He was actually a devout Muslim. And my mom came from a Catholic background, but she was a non-practicing Catholic. And so when my parents married, my father actually didn't ask my mother to convert there because she was essentially non-religious. And he was a little bit more progressive in his views as a Muslim. But he was, again, very devout. And so growing up, I was exposed day in and day out to Islam. And in fact, began to take Islam seriously when I was a high school student. Prior to that, my father would take me to prayer meetings and things like that. But I became very serious. I actually recited the Shahada, which is the declaration that Allah is the one true God and Muhammad is one true prophet. My father taught me how to pray. And I also began reading from the Quran. And after about 18 months or so, year and a half, I gave up on it in a number of reasons. Some of them were just simply the onerous nature of Islam. In Islam, prayer is not spending time in God's presence, communing with God in a relationship as we understand it as Christians, but it's rather an obligation that you're engaged in to try to satisfy Allah, to try to appease Allah. And
right.
Young man, that just became a bit onerous. Plus, there were the allures of the world, right? Rock music, girls, sports, that really captivated my interest. So by the time I graduated from high school, I began to even question if there was a God. So I became agnostic. And as an undergraduate student, taking courses in chemistry and in biology, my professors taught that the explanation for life was an evolutionary one, that evolutionary mechanisms could account for the origin and the design, the history of life. If that's the case, then what role is there for a creator to play? And I became very comfortable as an agnostic. Many of my professors were anti-Christian in their perspectives. They ridiculed Christianity. So I became very comfortable as an agnostic. As I went to grad school to pursue a PhD in biochemistry, though, things changed really rather dramatically. After about a year of really studying the cell's inner workings at an advanced level, I began my own original research project, began to read from the scientific literature. I was also taught that as a scientist, I needed to look at the evidence and independently draw my own conclusion, irrespective of what anybody else said. And it was the elegant design of biochemical systems and what I saw to be a fundamental problem with the origin of life, which is the evolutionary model that explains where life comes from and where biochemical systems come from. But the inadequacies of those explanations convinced me that there had to be a creator of some sort. And that, of course, then sent me on a different journey. Who is that creator and how do I relate to that creator? And it was really a pastor who challenged me to read the Bible. First time I read the Bible seriously as a 23-year-old. And it was really the Gospel of Matthew and the Sermon on the Mount that convicted me of my sin. And I would say that I had a religious experience. As I was reading the Sermon on the Mount, I was actually in a chemistry lab where I was doing my research as a graduate student. It was in the evening. Nobody else was in the building. I was there by myself. And I was reading from the Bible secretly so that no one would see what I was doing. And it was reading the Sermon on the Mount that, again, convinced me of my sin. But I had this overwhelming sense that there was a person present with me in the lab. I've never had an experience like that before, never had an experience like that since that time. And I just had this overwhelming conviction that what I was reading was true, and that the pastor had given me a little booklet on how to become a Christian. And I read through that booklet, recognizing that I just simply had to acknowledge my sin before God and appeal to Christ and his work on the cross for my salvation. And the remarkable thing was, not only was was I forgiven, but now I could be in an intimate relationship with the Creator that brought everything into existence around me. The very things that I was studying that were the Creator's handiwork was in and of itself remarkable to me. But then to think that I could be in a relationship with that Creator whose artistry that I was studying was, to me, absolutely mind-blowing, and is still mind-blowing to this very day. And so it was really science that pointed me to the reality of a Creator, and it was, the gospel that was being presented to me through the pages of Scripture that drew me to faith in Christ. But, as you were mentioning, we live in a world today where, people question whether science and Christianity are compatible, right? And the narrative is science equates to truth. And if science is incompatible with Christianity and science is true, well, Christianity must be false. But yet, it was really science that brought me to the point where I was able to properly understand and respond to the gospel. You can't respond to the gospel if you're not convinced that God exists.
Yeah, that's true. And so when you started looking, you are a young biochemist, you're studying to do this, you're enjoying it, obviously. It's not something you do and hate it and stay with it. So how did your perspective of what you were looking at under the microscope change from, just not being sure as an agnostic to all of a sudden just realizing, wow, this could not come from evolution?
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting, because even before becoming a Christian, even as an undergraduate student, when I was being introduced to biochemistry, I would marvel, and my professors would marvel, and even my fellow classmates would just marvel at the ingenuity of life. That life is remarkable. There is an elegance, there's a sophistication, there's an ingenuity. And so it wasn't uncommon for us to gather around, even as non-believers, and just say, look at how cool this is. This is absolutely amazing that it works this way, right? And we all would marvel. And it's very interesting because in many respects, I think scientists really are very close, even though it may not seem like it at times, to really having religious experiences when they think about the creation itself, regardless of the discipline they study. Everybody seems to be in awe and in wonder at the universe and the world around us. And in fact, there's a very interesting book written by a molecular biologist by the name of Ursula Goodenough, and the title of the book, I believe, is The Sacred Depths of Nature. And she describes herself as a religious non-believer, which is very interesting, where she describes these spiritual experiences that she has as an atheist as she contemplates nature. And the book is a small book, about 8 or 9 chapters, where she reflects upon different aspects of the creation, or in her case, nature. And she then has this religious response to it, where it's very clear that it's like Romans 1:20, right, where she is struggling to deny, in a sense, the reality of a God, but yet she suppresses that truth in unrighteousness. And I see that for so many scientists. So for me to become a Christian, and then to look at nature, in some respects, the awe and wonder didn't change. It was always there.
Okay.
It's just that now I understood that what I was seeing was indeed the handiwork of a creator who wanted a relationship with me and who pursued me even when I wasn't aware that this creator existed.
Which is what he does for all of us. And we can reject him in many different ways. It just happens in the field of science that it just happens more often. I know one young man, he's not that young anymore, I guess mid-30s, who I believe he went into field of science to disprove God. Mm-hmm. And personally, I've heard that story so many times. I've thought, good. Let's see if you can do that. So there's not anything to be afraid of if you're a parent out there and you have a son or daughter who wants to disprove God through science or archaeology, let them, because they can't. But it takes definite volitional rejection of what you are seeing under the microscope or through a telescope, like your partner, Hugh Ross. When you look at the perfection in everything around us and how things operate, to say, oh, this was an accident. So have you spent any time teaching? I know that when you do lectures, and you do a lot of them all over the world, I know you have a lot of young people coming up to you. What are some of the questions for those who are agnostic or flat out atheistic in their views? What do they ask you, and how do you respond?
Yeah, a lot of questions I end up getting are questions that are coming from, if they're coming from biology students, they typically are questions that reflect the standard mantra of the evolutionary paradigm. Those are the types of questions. What about this? What about that? Where superficially the evolution makes a lot of sense. It's not until you kind of peel back some of the layers and begin to ask more probing, more penetrating questions that I think the flaws in the evolutionary paradigm, become exposed. And so those are typically the questions that I see where these young people are essentially being sold, I would say, a bill of goods, where they're being presented with, again, this, the standard evolutionary explanation for things. But oftentimes those explanations, again, superficially make a lot of sense, but they really don't have the support at the most detailed level. And in fact, when I was an undergraduate student, I embraced the evolutionary paradigm wholesale. And it wasn't so much that I was convinced by the evidence, but it was because I admired my professors. I respected them, and they were telling me, well, this is how biologists understand the question of origins. And so I thought, well, if I want to be credible too, that's what I'm going to embrace. And it wasn't really until I was in a scenario where I was expected to think independently, that I was able to really ask, the hard questions. And I had, at that point, the knowledge base to begin to evaluate some of the answers coming my way. So, as an undergraduate student, if I would say, look, biochemical systems are amazing, how do we explain where they come from? The answer would be evolution did it. And I would have accepted that. As a grad student, it's like, okay, evolution did it, but now how? And when I asked that how question, where I said, I want the details now, I want the detailed explanation, that's where things began to unravel. And so oftentimes when I'm engaging students with a background in biology, they haven't rolled up their sleeves and asked those penetrating questions. And I think a lot of times they're afraid to ask those questions because, the university can be a very hostile place for someone who questions the evolutionary paradigm. Even if you don't embrace intelligent design or creation, if you even have the temerity to question the evolutionary paradigm, oftentimes it doesn't go well. And so there's an intimidation factor that really prevents, I think, genuine intellectual curiosity and genuine intellectual challenging of the mainstream ideas.
I see it as many times that someone who's a strict naturalist and can look at the complexity of a cell and RNA and the messenger RNA and how everything duplicates the cells and how proteins are built. I look at this and I think, how can they just take it that this evolved without asking the question, like you said, how?
Yeah.
I've often thought that the naturalist just has a very narrow view and really no questions to ask. So they don't look at this. But you kind of said in the beginning, even when you didn't think about God, a lot of scientists sit back in awe and wonder. And that's what God wants. That's what we do when we see God. It's awe and wonder.
Yeah.
So I don't get it. I have a hard time trusting someone who is so narrow on that. I would rather speak to somebody like yourself who can just say, okay, this is how it's built. And this is, I've listened to William Dembski and I've listened to many others just, talking about the flagellum motor. And then of course you have another view coming up, knocking that down because they don't want to admit there's no way this could have happened through natural, just step-by-step processes. It's silly.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. Well, let's just take the origin of life, because this is an area that I'm intimately familiar with. And, it's not uncommon when you engage origin of life researchers, and I have over the years, for them to be very quick to acknowledge, look, we have no clue how life originated through chemical evolution. Mm-hmm. I mean, we might have, some disparate observations, but that maybe suggest how it might have happened, but honestly, we don't really have any idea. And in fact, you oftentimes see people like Paul Davies or Francis Crick, who won the Nobel Prize for discovering the structure of DNA and shared that prize with Jim Watson and Maurice Wilkins, say things like, look, if you conclude the origin of life is a miracle, you would be forgiven, right? That this is completely understandable. But the point is that as scientists, we reject the idea that it was miraculous, that we insist upon some kind of mechanistic natural process explanation. And so this is oftentimes what's going on. It's really more an issue of philosophy than anything else, where today science operates according to a framework called methodological naturalism. And the idea behind methodological naturalism, which is distinct from philosophical naturalism, that's the view. Philosophical naturalism is the view there is no God. Methodological naturalism says, look, there may be a God, there may not be a God, but when we engage in science, we function as if God does not exist. We only look for mechanistic, materialistic explanations. We can't appeal to miracles. We can't appeal to agency. It all has to be mechanism. Now, and so this is a framework that many biologists operate under. Well, many scientists, not just biologists. And the idea here is that it's a type of atheism, if you will. It's a provisional atheism or a benchtop atheism. And in effect, it's no different functionally than from philosophical naturalism. And so this is the mindset that many scientists operate in. And in fact, many scientists probably have never given a lot of detailed or serious thought about religion. That's my experience. And so they just assume by default that they are atheists. They operate within a discipline that is intrinsically atheistic in terms of its functionality. And that oftentimes leads people to default atheism. And so on one hand, they are looking at, how DNA, contains information to make proteins and how that information is, processed by the cell's machinery, and they look at it with awe and wonder. They see it as absolutely amazing and astounding. And yet they would then argue that we have to come up with a materialistic explanation. And that oftentimes locks them into a type of default atheism. And if you can help them see that, many times there is I think a willingness to be open, but it takes a lot of effort to push people away from methodological naturalism because it's so inculcated into scientists as part of their education.
It definitely is. From you start learning all of this in middle school and up in high school, and I used to look at my daughter's science books and just kind of show them, they're not explaining this side of the story, mm-hmm. and so that they could just have that asking questions about, and they went to a supposedly Christian school. They were at an independent school, but I still had to open up their books and point out mm-hmm. different items that would make them think and not just regurgitate what they were being taught mm-hmm. as far as evolution. And fortunately, God had already put me into apologetics and learning different things. So I had access to different scientific books that I'd picked up from Ratio Christi seminars and from other places once I found out about Reasons to Believe. So I did have resources at the time, which a lot of people don't. And so I want to change that for people and help them, help their children be able to be curious and not worry about getting shut down. So I did want to ask you, I hadn't heard of one of the books that I mentioned in the intro, the Fit, what is it, Fit for a Purpose?
Yes. Can
you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, that's one of my more recent books. And
okay.
In a nutshell, the book is about the idea that the anthropic principle, which people think about in terms of cosmology, actually applies to chemical and biochemical systems. And so, for people that are not familiar with the anthropic principle, it's actually considered by many people to be one of the most compelling arguments for design, for a role that a creator must have played in the origin of the universe. And the idea behind the anthropic principle is that the constants of physics are exact, that if any one of them deviates ever so slightly, in fact, even imperceptibly from the value that it holds, the universe simply can't sustain life. Sometimes this is called the fine-tuning of the universe. And again, many people see this is an idea that is almost universally accepted by astronomers, that there is a fine-tuning to the universe. Now, the question is, how do we explain that fine-tuning? And one of those explanations is that fine-tuning reflects design and purpose, that the universe is fit for a purpose, and that purpose is life itself. And so the question on the table is, does that idea actually extend into biochemistry? And so in this book, Fit for a Purpose, which is probably one of my more technical books, I make the case that there is a just rightness to biochemistry, just as there is a just rightness to the universe. That if the universe was even ever so slightly different than the way it is now, there's no way that life could exist. And my argument in the book is that when we look at biochemical systems, they have the just right properties that make them suitable for life, and that there are not alternate molecules or alternate systems that could work, that these systems are unique, that they not only are just right, but they are unique, and that there's a type of biochemical fine-tuning that we see. And the idea of all these coincidences lining up so that life is possible either means we won the lottery or that there is a purpose behind biology itself. And that purpose is really the advent of life. So that's really the point of the book in a nutshell. It's another type of design argument that involves the anthropic principle and really the perfection and the optimization of biochemical systems.
What's amazing to me is I don't always think people understand how fragile we are. That when something breaks down in our cell, until you get sick, of course, that everything is working like a fine-tuned machine. And that's something I know we're becoming more health conscious. Fantastic, hallelujah, finally. But we take a lot of things for granted. That's just human nature. And something like this is really good for people to know about. And like you say, maybe it's too technical for some. I've had people open up some of the books that I've gotten over the years and say, oh, this is really technical, and they're not interested. But the way you just broke it down is intriguing to me enough to get that and use it as a tool. So how do you had one on transhumanism too, that you wrote a while back. I think it was 2019 or 17. Yeah. Okay. Long before people were a lot of people were talking about it and were aware of what's going on. What are the dangers? I mean, knowing that there's a balance, like fit for a purpose of what is going on in our bodies, how perfect the cells are, how everything has a balance. What are the dangers of like CRISPR technology, which is, gene splicing? And can you speak to that?
Yes. Yeah. Well, CRISPR is a revolutionary technology that gives scientists and really biomedical researchers the capacity to alter the genetic makeup of organisms with a high degree of precision. Okay. And this includes, the genetic makeup of human beings. And the technology is very easy to use. It's relatively inexpensive, and it's extremely powerful. And it holds the promise of revolutionizing medicine in that it provides a means for us to finally treat people with genetic disorders. So we're not just simply managing the symptoms of a genetic disorder, but we can maybe even step in and intervene in such a way that we can undo the mutations that have caused the genetic disorder, replacing defective genes or at least defective regions of the DNA with healthy versions of those regions. And in doing so, either mitigate the symptoms of a genetic disease or maybe even cure somebody from a genetic disease. But this very same technology can be used to create designer human beings and maybe even augment or extend human beings beyond their natural limits, giving us greater strength, a greater degree of intelligence, make us more psychologically well-adjusted. And so there is a real interest in using the technology, not just simply for biomedical purposes, which I think is a really wonderful use of the technology, to actually using it to enhance human beings, with an eye towards maybe even using the technology to modify human beings to such a degree that what we end up creating would not be recognizable anymore as a human being. And this concept is really the heart of a movement called transhumanism, which is the idea that we have a moral obligation to use science and technology to enhance human beings beyond our natural limits, with the hope of, creating a type of utopian world, and maybe even overcoming the greatest limitation that we have as human beings, which is our mortality. And so there are some people who see transhumanism as a pathway to attain a type of practical immortality or a type of eternal life. And so it's an idea that is very much couched in science and technological terms, but it's at the end of the day a religious movement. And so to me, there's really two dangers here. One is, what are the unintended consequences of manipulating human beings, moving us beyond our natural limits? But also, what about the misuse of the technology because of our sinful nature as human beings? That in and of itself is rather frightening. But at the end of the day, it's creating a mindset where our salvation isn't found in the gospel. It's found in what science and technology can deliver. And so you mentioned at the top of the show, that we live in a world that is becoming increasingly secular, right? We live in a world where people question whether or not any religious system has validity or has value, including Christianity, where there's a narrative that science completely undermines religion, including Christianity, and that science solves our problems. And so should we not just simply turn to science as the source of our salvation? And so it becomes really an alternate gospel, or a competitor to the gospel, or a false gospel. And so there's really two dangers here. One is the misuse of the technology, but the second is really, I think, even a greater danger, and that is a large portion of our world could be persuaded that the way to find salvation and ultimate hope and purpose and destiny is in science as opposed to the gospel. So as Christians, we've got to be, in a position to engage this idea and engage it well.
That's the first thing I think of is people using it to have a longer life. And then it becomes not natural. But I wonder what will happen when we start to see this. And I really feel, I know the technology is there, but it's not out there yet, or people don't know about it, where humans are being augmented. They're trying to push it out there slowly or to let us know about it. But there are some of us who know it's already there. You have people that are, like with AI and at the World Economic Forum, and you hear them speaking in terms that humans are mere vessels to be robots or cyborgs, and that there is no human soul, really. And that's all just something that was made up to make people feel better, which, that's, I believe, Karl Marx said that it was the opiate of the masses, religion. So you have to wonder, and there are no stopgaps. When we live in a world like this, who's going to say no if they're already doing it? And it's almost as if this is marching right towards the mark of the beast, eventually. What are you all talking about, in your field, in your circles?
Yeah, well, I mean, the concerns that you raise are, the same concerns that I would have, right? And and it's also, very easy to demonize transhumanists. And many of the people that I know that are transhumanists are probably not tied up in any kind of grand conspiracy, so to speak. They are just simply people that really want to just live forever, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what I see oftentimes with transhumanists is ideals that are noble in some respect, where they realize, look, there's pain and suffering in the world, and this is not right. It's not the way it's supposed to be. That there's an injustice in the world, and that we want a better future, right? They recognize that death is the enemy, that there's something tragic to think about human beings just simply disappearing from the earth, that there's some value in humanity as a species. And they are just simply looking for some hope, for some purpose, for some destiny, and they're turning to the wrong place. And so that what I see with transhumanism is it's really laying bare some of the most profound needs that any human being could have and does have. And these are needs that are only fulfilled in the gospel itself. But what transhumanism is doing is bringing this conversation about salvation to the forefront, where the question is ultimately, where can we find salvation? So if we are wise as Christians, we can use the transhumanism as an incredible leverage and platform to present the gospel and to show that technology will never save us, that technology is only going to disappoint us. And there's a very interesting problem that arises because of transhumanism. It's called the salvation paradox. And the idea here is that anything you would do to save human beings or to save humanity would require that you would alter human beings to such a degree that what is resulting is not a human being anymore, but it's something of our own making. And so what you're saving isn't a human being or isn't yourself, but you're saving a successor to yourself. You're saving a successor to human beings. So in other words, in order to save yourself or to save human beings, you essentially have to destroy yourself or destroy humanity. That's the salvation paradox. But that is, to me, one of the most compelling reasons to recognize that technology is never going to save us, and that transhumanism is ultimately a false gospel. But it's going to be very alluring to people who think in secular terms, right? Because if you are truly secular, there is no hope or purpose or destiny. Nihilism is the logical outworking of atheism, of materialism. Mm-hmm. Nothing matters, and when it comes to an end, it comes to an end. And people can't live with that. And so people try to create some kind of meaning, right? And so you see atheists talk about, well, there is no meaning to life, but I'm going to create my own meaning. Well, existentialism is essentially a response to nihilism, which basically says human beings cannot live without meaning or purpose. And transhumanism carries it to an extreme where we say not only can we not live without meaning and purpose, we've got to somehow create our own destiny. We have to do something to give ourselves hope and a direction to our existence. There's a deep desire every human being has to connect to the transcendent. And this is what transhumanism is exposing. And so, yes, there's a lot of things to be concerned about in terms of the technology and its use and misuse and unintended consequences. We need to proceed carefully and slowly as we look at using this for good purposes. But it does give legitimacy, at least at first glance, to transhumanism. And if we're not prepared to engage that as Christians, it could be a real problem as we go into the future. Transhumanism is going to be one of the most influential ideas in the next couple of decades that shapes our world. We've got to be prepared to engage it.
I agree. I think it's it's a big, like you mentioned, it's a huge opportunity for Christians to have those conversations with their friends. Maybe they're scientists, maybe they are considering altering their genetics so that they can, or they think they're going to live forever. And we need to have those conversations of, if you're altering also your mind, will you be able to have those conversations with God anymore? Or are you going to have so many other voices inside of you, because it's programming, that you won't be able to, where's your soul in all of this?
Yeah.
And I am asking you this because I have heard of chips in your brain, and they're reading your impulses, and that's a real thing. When they talk about singularity and where all of this knowledge is going, all you have to do is think it, and it's being beamed up, Scotty, up to a satellite somewhere, and gathering everyone's thoughts.
Yeah. Well, this idea of chips in our brain, this is something that Elon Musk is working to develop with his company Neuralink, is a real thing. In fact, these are called brain-computer interfaces, and it's one of the most highly one of the areas in bioengineering that is of highest interest. And some incredible advances are happening where you can implant these electronic devices in people's brains, and those devices, through machine learning algorithms, can extract user intent and then affect action on computer software and computer hardware. Now, this is wonderful on one hand because it's going to revolutionize medicine in a different way than CRISPR. For people that are amputees, through these brain-computer interfaces, they can learn to control robotic prosthetic limbs. Quadriplegic and paraplegic patients can learn to control exoskeletons that would grant them mobility. People that are locked in can communicate now with these brain-computer interfaces. But there is concern that these things are actually altering human beings, altering our identity as human beings. There's a whole area of bioethics now called neural ethics that has emerged because of brain-computer interfaces. So, for example, you can treat people with Parkinson's disease with brain-computer interfaces where there's electrical stimulation sent to certain areas of the brain, and this arrests Parkinson's symptoms. The problem is that patients that have undergone these treatments become less risk averse. And so the question becomes, are they truly giving consent when they have these brain-computer interfaces implanted in their brains, if their behavior is less averse to risk, right? Also the brain-computer interface is extracting user intent. So who's actually making a decision? Is it the brain-computer interface? Is it the patient? Or is it some collaboration? And would that patient have made the same decision if it wasn't for the brain-computer interface? And then there's even crazier stuff going on where people are looking at tethering brains together using brain-computer interfaces, where hypothetically, I could have a brain-computer interface in my brain, you could have one in your brain, and we could actually be communicating with each other, even though we are in remote parts of the world, where I can send my thoughts to you and you can send your thoughts to me. This is really bizarre stuff, but there's experimental results showing that these brain-brain interfaces are actually possible. And so that being the case, now your question about what happens to our identity, who's actually in control when we make decisions? Are there going to be these many voices that are in our heads such that we don't even know who we are anymore? And how does this impact our fundamental nature as human beings? The model that I hold to, and it's just a model for how the relationship between our brain, our mind, and our spirit is a model that I picked up from a Christian neuroscientist by the name of Matthew Stanford. And his idea is that there's really a tripart nature to who we are. We have our brain, which is our physical makeup, and there's hardware there that is critical to our identity as human beings. And so it's like a computer system. And then you can think of our mind and our spirit as maybe being our soul, where the mind and the spirit, of course, are immaterial aspect of our nature. That's like the software. And so the hardware and the software have to be working in conjunction for that computer system to operate. Likewise, our brain and our minds and our spirit have to be intact, and they are working together. But our brains can influence our minds can influence our brain, our spirit can influence our mind, and in turn influence our brain. So there's this dynamic interplay. And so you could very well not only compromise the hardware with brain-computer interfaces, which again could lead to a loss of our identity, but if you're starting to tether brains together and there's an immaterial aspect to your nature, what is that doing to you as a human being? And are you actually damaging or marring or distorting the image of God? Mm-hmm. I don't know, but these are very real questions that, are disquieting, and so, here we see an example of technology that could be used for incredible good that could very easily be misused or have unintended consequences in such a way that are devastating, to human beings. I mean, think about, this whole gender affirming care, right? The mainstream mantra in the medical community is that it's cruel to not transition, young children, right? Mm-hmm. Gender dysphoria. And we're just now beginning to see an increasing number of people in the medical community in different parts of the world saying gender affirming care is doing horrendous damage to young people. Mm-hmm. But for those young people that have been damaged, it's too late, right? Yes. Same with brain computer interfaces, that superficially it looks like these are wonderful things. And I'm very interested in seeing them used for medical purposes, for humanitarian purposes. But where is that line? And it's very easy to cross that line. And when you do, could you do damage that could not be reversed?
And that's I think that's the dilemma when you're working with, like you said, atheist, agnostic, someone who just is a total naturalist. They see this as advancement, as the answer to, well, we are smart enough now, we can move evolution along. And they see nothing past that. It's okay. But as a God-fearing person, a Christian, even a God-fearing, Muslim or whatever, you've got to recognize, what are you doing mm-hmm. to that individual that is communicating with God? And that's such a special thing. And right now, the enemy, Satan, he cannot read our mind. Yeah. So to me, this is on a total spiritual level. This is Satan's way of okay, now I'm going to be able to read your mind. Yeah. and get involved in those communications, whereas before he would not. Yeah. And I have a big problem with that, Fuzz. And what I see as what I think of when I think of all of this, and I just sit there and contemplate what's happening. And yes, they might be able to extend their life, but flesh breaks down. So what are they going to start to do with that, with mm-hmm. just our flesh? And I just think of what the book of Revelation says, where people will want to die and they won't be able to.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know. I might be extrapolating that completely wrong. I don't know.
Well, I mean, when you there's a number of views in terms of how people approach the book of Revelation. But if you take kind of a premillennial view, you see it as being prophetic, which is what I lean towards. Boy, with advances in technology, suddenly when you read Revelation, things begin to make sense, or they seem to be what seem to be hard to imagine or is very easy to imagine. And so, you're right. When you start thinking about, end times prophecy in light of transhumanism, it really is really eye-opening in terms of the fact that we are progressing at such a rapid rate towards seeing this technology being implemented, and probably implemented in ways that are not really very thoughtful. It's interesting, oftentimes, the question is posed, should we play God? And my response is always, well, as image bearers, we have no choice but to play God, because we are made in God's image, and God has given us dominion over creation, which means that we can use biotechnology to do interesting things that falls under the purview of our dominion. The issue is not playing God, but it's trying to take God's place. And what I see with transhumanism is people trying to take God's place. And while God gave us as human beings dominion over creation, he alone has dominion over human beings. And so it's one thing out of compassion to develop medical treatments for people that are suffering, maybe even curing people from diseases. Though that seems to me to be consistent with this idea of loving our neighbor as ourselves, where medicine is really a gift from God. But when you start going to the point of enhancements, now you are starting to argue that as human beings, we have a right to even modify ourselves, that we have the dominion over humanity. And I think that is moving us outside of the bounds that God has given to us as human beings. And it moves us very rapidly towards the place where we're looking to take God's place, where we are ourselves now looking to become creators, if you will, not in a biblical sense, where creating is actually manifesting the image of God and bringing glory to God, but rather creating in the sense of the people that build the Tower of Babel, right? Where there's an attitude that God is no longer necessary, that we are becoming gods ourselves. That is a natural extension of the transhumanist mindset.
Now, is that, that is, those have been my thoughts, and it is getting very close to the Tower of Babel, and how the thought of we are going to put ourselves in the place of God, and because we have the capability to do it. And in that time, it was the technology that they had to maybe rise above another flood. I've heard that version of why they were building something that tall, but when you actually read the Hebrew, it is God gate. So they were trying to get to God through there. So it's, God sees our heart, and he knows what we're thinking. I just want to put a picture of your book here, Humans 2.0. So do you talk about this in this book?
I don't get into kind of the eschatology, at least in terms of the implications for how we would understand revelations and end times in Humans 2.0. It's mostly laying out, hey, what is the technology? What is transhumanism? What are some of the ethical questions that arise? And really, how does this connect to the gospel? Maybe there needs to be a follow-up version to the book where we tackle, what does transhumanism mean in terms of, how we would understand the book of Revelation and eschatology in those terms. But so yes and no. I talk about some of that, but not all of that in the book. Okay.
Does it touch on some obviously biochemistry of
It does. I have a full chapter on CRISPR gene editing, where I explain to people how it works and what are some of the technical limitations. There's a chapter on anti-aging. This is something that's also interesting. A lot of times when we think about anti-aging, we think about snake oil salesmen, things like that. But the fact of the matter is there's some very interesting work that's being done in anti-aging that is bona fide, scientific work, where people are beginning to operate with the assumption that we very well may, in the near future, extend human life expectancy on the order of several hundreds of years. And then I also talk about brain-computer interfaces, and then again also get into some of the ethical concerns, and then really what is transhumanism and how does it relate to the gospel.
Okay, a lot of what we were just talking about.
Yes.
Okay. Also, a while back, and I have I have a lot of your books, but one of them is Creating Life in the Lab. And were you thinking about this when you wrote that? This kind of gene splicing? Because I know it's been about 15 years, but it was on the cover of Time or Newsweek, where you could have a designer baby and just kind of, if you want a child with blue eyes, they can do some genetic modification while it's still in the womb. I don't know. Maybe that's not what it's about at all.
Well, I mean, the idea of designer babies would be something that would be discussed in Humans 2.0.
Okay.
Creating life in the lab could maybe be thought of to some degree as a prequel to Humans 2.0. It's actually a prequel to another book that I'm currently finishing up called Should We Play God? And it's, but the idea behind creating life in the lab is to some degree related to some of the content in Humans 2.0 in the sense that we now, as scientists, have the capability of creating artificial, non-natural life forms in the lab. And so in creating life in the lab, my focus is only on the creation of artificial cells, right, or synthetic cells. And then in Should We Play God, I'm extending it to include, things like creating human-animal chimeras, those types of things, creating synthetic embryos, all that other fun stuff. Mm-hmm. But creating life in the lab is really meant to be a design argument. And the idea here is that as we are developing the capability of creating protocells in the lab, or taking bacteria and fundamentally engineering them into these synthetic cells, that this work actually provides evidence that life must come from the handiwork of a creator. So it's really a design argument. And the idea here is that to create even a relatively simple protocell involves enormous amount of ingenuity on the part of researchers. It requires detailed manipulations in the lab using highly skilled scientists that are relying on a couple of centuries of accumulated scientific knowledge, and that these researchers are again doing these precise, detailed, highly controlled manipulations in the lab. And so the point is that this indicates that to go from simple chemicals to complex or to even protocells requires intelligent agency, requires ingenuity. Apart from the work of, in lab, people working in the lab, and apart from the work of intelligent agents, these kind of transformations couldn't be affected. And so therefore, we could see work in synthetic biology and the creation of synthetic cells is really empirical evidence that intelligent agencies needed for the origin of life. So it's a design argument. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm not hearing you.
I muted myself because I don't know if you heard the dog barking.
I did.
Sorry. Every time humans get involved in manipulating anything that God has done with perfection, something, I believe, is going to go wrong. And I guess if you are an atheist and you believe in evolution and you think you're just furthering evolution along, giving it a boost, I guess you'll be a little bit more, I guess you'll be bolder than someone who knows that we were created just the way God wanted us. And yeah, we've got some problems. We have breakdown of cells that cause diseases and such. I don't know. As a scientist, and you collaborate with others, like you say, transhumanists, they're just trying to extend their life. Is there thought to this?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think your point that when we start manipulating things in nature, that things are eventually going to go wrong. And interestingly enough, people that are philosophers of technology almost universally would agree with you, right? They actually are one of the unexpected allies for the Christian worldview as we look to navigate a world where this type of technology is emerging. So philosophers of technology are very quick to recognize that technology is a double-edged sword. It might deliver some kind of benefit, but there's always a cost associated with it. And many times we don't even anticipate what that genuine cost actually is. There's unintended consequences, even when people are trying to do noble things with the technology, things go wrong in ways that we could never imagine.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you bring in sin into the equation, now you also have people that would actively use that technology for nefarious purposes. And the technology we're dealing with here is very powerful. And so the more powerful it is, the more horrific the outcome is when things go wrong, whether unintentionally or intentionally. And so philosophers of technology are very quick to recognize this. And the problem is that these advances are happening so rapidly that ethicists don't have time to properly deliberate on the technology. Should it be developed? If it should, how should it be developed? How should we look to use it? What are the safeguards that need to be in place before the next, these deliberations aren't even done before the next wave of advance and the next wave of advance and the next wave of advance happens. I actively read the scientific literature in these areas, and it's impossible to keep up with what's going on. It's happening so rapidly at such breakneck speeds that what we thought was going to be unimaginable today, in 6 months, people are doing. And so this is frightening because nobody has the space to properly think about what we're doing, right? And you're right. For somebody who is an atheist who holds to a materialistic worldview, things are going to evolve. So why not just step in and push that and nudge evolution in the direction that we want it to go? We have a sensitivity for the fact that things, can indeed go wrong. One thing that it's important to realize, though, is Christians, we are redeemed. And as redeemed people, we of all people have, first of all, the image of God in us being restored to how it was originally created. After the fall, all humans retain the image of God, but the image of God is damaged, it's distorted. And it's through our rebirth that we are able to begin the process of recovering the image of God. And through sanctification, we increasingly assume God's image as it's intended, meaning that we actually have the wherewithal to execute the original commands that God gave us as human beings, as image bearers, to exercise dominion over the world, to subdue the world and bring it under our control, to be stewards of the planet. So as redeemed people, we have a resource that atheists and materialists don't have. We also have the Holy Spirit that guides us, gives us wisdom and insight. We have scriptures that teach wisdom that is, even though this wisdom was imparted thousands of years ago is still pertinent and relevant in a world that the biblical authors could not even have imagined. And so as redeemed people, we alone, I think, have the wherewithal of anybody to step in and to utilize this kind of technology in the right way. Or we have the greatest chance of using it in a way that promotes human flourishing, that cares for the environment, and minimizes exploitation of marginalized people.
Yeah.
But if we recapitulate, then it's going to be atheists and materialists that don't have these resources that are going to dictate where things are going. So we have an obligation to not only engage, but maybe even to encourage young people in the church who have an orientation towards science and engineering and medicine to maybe think about making their calling work in these areas where they represent salt and light, in an area that desperately needs a Christian influence.
Yes, and as you're talking, I'm just thinking, it's going through my head. We already know we will live forever with the Lord, and so this material world becomes less important, and the spiritual side of our relationship with God becomes much more important. And so we really do have a completely different worldview and a different way of thinking about life and life here. We know it's temporary, and we've been told that in Scripture. This really isn't our home. But you're right. If Christians do not speak up and learn about these things, then what happens is you have a world that really wants eternal life, which they're not going to get. But in the meanwhile, they could do a lot of damage to themselves. Maybe up front, it might be a good thing, and then things are going to start rejecting in our bodies, because even a cell that is defective, it gets booted out eventually of the system of who we are, and our bodies. But it's a whole different different thing we need to think about and start to educate ourselves on. And as a science lover, that's not a big deal for me. I love diving into this stuff, but there are people who it's so mind-blowing. They don't understand how we're on this precipice right now.
Yeah.
How close we are.
I agree. I think, the concerns are real. And, this is the issue, the dilemma here is much of this technology we're talking about can be used for really good purposes, right? And many times the people that are trying to develop the technology have noble motivations. They just want to help people, right? And whether it's the human enhancement technologies or whether it's, other types of biotechnologies that people are working in these days. But on the other hand, they can be horribly misused. And so there's this very uncomfortable tension. But, much of the technology too can be used by Christians to advance the kingdom of God, right? To improve the world, to promote human flourishing, things that would, I think, bring honor and glory to God. But this technology is never going to truly save us. I mean, we have to wait for the return of Christ for the kingdom of God to be fully, manifested, to be fully present, if you will. We live in that tension of already, but not yet. Something else that I think is missing in this conversation is a theology of suffering, right? That we also recognize that as Christians, that while we always want to do what we can to mitigate pain and suffering that people experience, we also recognize that God works through pain and suffering to transform people, right, to accomplish greater good and higher purposes. And so, just because somebody is suffering from a disease, we want to do what we can to make them comfortable, to help them. But we also need to recognize that God can be at work through that suffering as well. And that what we see maybe as something that is horrific is actually accomplishing an incredible good. And so this is something that's also missing from this conversation too, is just this notion of the role that suffering plays in the life of a believer, or the role that suffering can play in a non-believer's life in terms of helping them to realize their need for the gospel.
Oh, that's so true. Thank you for bringing that up. Well, are there any closing thoughts that you would like to give to the person who maybe has someone in their life that is a scientist and just does not want to venture past that naturalistic point of view?
Yeah. Well, to me, I would say that the best way to engage somebody like that may not be so much with arguments right away, but it might be to try to inspire in that person a sense of wonder. And so to ask the question, as a scientist, what do you marvel at in the creation? What do you marvel at in the areas that you study, right? And then use that as maybe a way to introduce the idea of the beauty of creation and the ingenuity of creation as a way to maybe open them up to thinking about the idea that maybe there is indeed a God that's responsible. I think this idea of transhumanism becomes really valuable in the sense that that people need hope, purpose, and destiny. And I think asking somebody that question, where do you find hope? Where do you find purpose? What is your destiny? Right? Those are questions that I think can get conversations going. It's challenging to try to go toe to toe with somebody who's a scientist, particularly if you're not a scientist. It's challenging for me as a scientist to go toe to toe with another scientist in terms of the evidence. I think evidence is necessary. It plays arguments for design, challenges to evolution play a critical role. But if I was a non-scientist engaging a scientist, I would go down the path of beauty and wonder and really asking those questions about hope and purpose and destiny.
I like that a lot. Thank you so much. All right. Where do people go to find your work, to find more information they might be interested in?
Well, the best place to go would be reasons.org, which is our website. And there people can find all kinds of articles and videos that engage a wide range of science faith questions. We have a YouTube channel, Reasons to Believe, where we have programming that we release weekly, podcasts and other types of videos that again span the range in terms of engaging different science faith topics at different levels of technical, at different technical levels. Some are really geeky shows, and other videos are much more lay oriented. So those would be two great places that people could go to get access to resources that we have at Reasons to Believe.
Okay. And do you still teach some classes at SES?
I do.
Okay.
I teach courses that are in the certificate program for scientific apologetics. Also have an adjunct position at Biola University as well in their science and religion program and their apologetics program.
So if you're out there and you're thinking, wow, I really want to take that next step, and you love biology, you love biochemistry, go check out the curriculum at Biola in their apologetics program and Southern Evangelical Seminary. So thank you, Dr. Rana, for being here. I'm thrilled. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me.
God bless you and your work.